And so next in the chapter, he returns to the idea of the three realms that was introduced in chapter 1, that the study of human affairs was essentially divided into the economy, the polity, and the civil society. And what we want to look at next is how an economic system would succeed in the economy. What would be a success? What would be an economic system succeeding in the polity and then again in the civil society? And then he also wants to look at, well, what does it mean for an economic system to fail in the economy or the polity or the civil society? For an economic system to be successful in the realm of the economy, he has a very important definition or description. And that is a successful economic system in the economy would be one that produces an economic surplus and uses the surplus productively. Okay? So not only does the system need to actually produce an economic surplus, which is a little bit more than you need just to keep yourselves alive, but then you got to do something with that surplus that's productive. Without both of those being met, this society will not economically develop and grow. So one thing we have to think about is the way economists look at our output. When we have a certain amount of output, there's really only two things that can be done using our jargon. You can consume it or you can invest it. So out of all output, the part that you consume and that is no longer in existence and available for future production is called consumption. And whatever you don't consume is by definition saved and invested. And when we talk about investment in this sense, what we're talking about is using some of the output to produce new capital. And all capital is what we will need in order to produce next year's output. Okay, so we have 5 different forms of capital listed here, and we will discuss each one of them. The physical capital is perhaps the most common one in economics, as you're literally producing the machinery that you would need, the tools, the equipment that you would need to produce more output in the future. But let's just take a moment and just think about what we're saying is a successful economic system produces enough output to A, feed yourselves and keep you alive, plus B, something called surplus that is then used in a productive manner that will allow you to continue to produce next period and ideally even grow your output. So that's what we're talking about with this really important phrase that he's using here, that to have a successful economic system, be successful in the economic realm, what we're describing is a system that generates the economic surplus and generates the incentives to use the surplus productively. So if we are productively using our surplus, we are building up capital or accumulating capital. As we saw on the previous slide, there are 5 different types of capital. Economists tend to focus more on physical and financial capital. Physical capital, like I said before, was like the machinery and equipment. Financial capital could be actually the money that you would need. And then even in more recent years, economists even look at human capital, which is the acquisition of knowledge and skills that labor acquires over time, either on the job or by going back to school. And it's really these areas that has been the focus of economists when they look at a country that is not economically developing. The idea is, oh, you're missing some capital. So here's some physical capital, here's some financial capital, or even they did for a while just say, oh, here's some educational training. And so they were thinking, hey, that's going to be what helps this country grow. So it didn't actually work out that way. So it became apparent that there's more to growing a economic system, or excuse me, growing the economy than just injecting capital. And so there are other 2 types of capital that are being mentioned, which is social and cultural capital. The problem is those are more the realm of the community, not really something as part of the economy. So we'll come back to those. Okay, so then the main point of what makes an economy successful is the economic system needs to develop and grow the economy to be successful. And in order to do that, the economic system has to yield a surplus and make productive use of that surplus. So there needs to be enough output to cover today's consumption with some extra available for capital accumulation of all those different types of capital. And that way you can replace any capital that's been worn out as well as invest in any new capital. And all of this is about the capital being able to continue to produce the output and to grow the output and to grow the surplus. And so that is the overall goal of an economic system, if you want to call it being successful in the economy. So for different economic systems, how it goes about generating the surplus, if it does, and if it does generate the surplus, does it have a system or a set of incentives built in that actually cause you to use the surplus productively? Well, that's going to be different for different types of economic systems. And so he briefly introduces 3 types of economic systems that we will see more in later chapters. So he first introduces the primitive society, which will show up in the community-centered economic system in chapter 5. And so we're seeing here that this type of economic system did not generate a surplus. We don't even have to worry about the productive use of the surplus. Their system simply didn't have a need or a use for a surplus, so there's no reason to generate any more than you needed. And while that might have worked fine for them if they had been left alone, many of the primitive societies find themselves bumping up against another type of economic system, one that we'll see more in chapter 4 under the state-centered chapter, and that is empires. And so empires were much better at generating the surplus. They are a state-centered economic system, so they had the power that was able to direct the resources in a way that generated the surplus. And some of them used the surplus quite productively, at least for a time. But quite often, empires would get in a situation where at least some of the surplus is being used in unproductive ways. It could be directed towards war and destruction. It could be directed towards the ruler just having a really good life. So a lot of times that didn't persist as a successful economic system. And then he introduces capitalism, and it is the one that he says has been the most successful in the economic realm. If we look generally at what it takes to determine the size of the economic surplus, he mentions, first of all, of course, the quantity and quality of the resources, what technology you have to turn those inputs into outputs, and what is the quality of the institutions you have that support the production process. Those 3 things is what's going to, if your answers are good, is what's going to allow you to generate an economic surplus. And that is why he argues that capitalism has seen more growth than any other economic system, because capitalism harnesses the incentives to reinvest and grow resources and innovate technology. And so that's why capitalism has been a success in the economy, in the realm of the economy, as long as the proper institutions are in place. So now you see why we spent the time talking about the institutions in their role in chapter 1. So there's 3 factors that really have contributed to capitalism being the economic system that has had the most success in the economy. The first one is built into the system is a competitive pressure to push businesses to lower their costs. We talked about that in the opening quote. So there's this incentive to keep your costs down and your output up, what we would call productivity, which is output per worker, or you can measure it as output per hour of work. The second thing is that market competition is giving you that reason to reinvest the surplus and use it productively. All right, that was a big part of what makes an economic system successful. So built into capitalism is this competitive pressure to reinvest in technology and to continue to improve your productive capacity. Because if you don't, you'll be less efficient than your competitors, and you might just lose out completely. So those who are most efficient and productive will triumph. And then the third he mentions is the private property rights. Because private property is an important part of capitalism, it means that any profits that are generated will go to those who took the risk, which of course then gives you the incentive to take the risk in the first place. And one of the things we can see about capitalism is more than any other system of any type, it has unleashed more human energy and creativity than ever seen before in history. And to use his language, it has been the best at generating a surplus and the incentives necessary to use that surplus productively. So all of that is just to illustrate what he's showing in his figure on 2.1, that capitalism is fostering the accumulation of capital and its productive use of the surplus. The system will drive firms to maximize profits. Part of maximizing profits is minimizing your costs, and that incentive is pushing you to productive and allocative efficiency. And those two together are essentially called economic efficiency, what Keynes was mentioning in the opening quote. And then for a firm to survive, obviously it has to generate profits so that they can then reinvest their profits and continue to grow and improve their production. All this is to say is that capitalism has created a positive feedback loop. Once a surplus of production exists, it means you can trade. You can use your extra stuff to get some stuff that you're not making, right? And once trading exists, that means I can get more specialized. I don't have to focus on making everything because I can really just focus on this one thing and make a lot of it and then use that to get the other items that I want. And then the act of specialization is actually one of the things that will increase productivity in the capitalist system. Productivity is more output. And so your surplus will actually increase. So not only does capitalism lead to a surplus, but the positive feedback loop tends to lead to a growing surplus. So you have a surplus, allows trade, allows specialization, which leads to even more productivity, which is more surplus. So that's the positive feedback loop of capitalism. So the positive feedback loop means that capitalism is a system that generates a surplus and encourages us to use a surplus productively. It's why it's considered the most successful in the economic realm. The last issue he mentions is a little more of a macro issue. How is it decided what countries specialize in? So the surplus generated trade, generated specialization, etc. How did one country end up making one thing and another country made another thing? How does that get decided? And this, he mentioned some topics you should recognize from microeconomics. Comparative advantage. Whichever country is relatively is the key word, more efficient than another should be producing that particular good. So just to remind you, absolute advantage was a concept where you're a country that can just outproduce another country in a good. But the idea is it doesn't matter if you can outproduce everybody and everything because you're just so big and powerful. You're still going to be relatively better at some things than others because we just are either equipped with better resources or better technology, so that the better we are at one thing, the more it costs us and what we are giving up when we go and produce something else. And so that opportunity cost is what is captured in comparative advantage. So this is just to remind you, in a more macro sense, it's the overall, first of all, it's the overall capitalist system that is generating the surplus and generating the incentives to use it productively. But in a broader sense of the economy, following these sorts of market pressures of following the comparative advantage will also lead all countries to grow their surplus through trade, through specialization, and then specialization increases productivity. And then that's back to a positive feedback loop. All right, so that gets us through what makes an economy successful. What about the polity? So the question becomes, what does it mean for an economic system to be successful in the polity? Reminding ourselves from chapter 1 that it is the state that is the primary governance structure of the polity. This is state kind of synonymous with government. They're not specifically the same terms. In political science, you would never say they're the same terms, but you can kind of think of it that. I mean, obviously, it's not state like Texas or Mississippi. It's more like a government type thing, governance structure. All right, so what he's going to do is say that every state can be described across these two dimensions. One is how much is the state involved in the economy. If it is highly involved in the economy, then there's a lot of regulations, a lot of taxation, laws, policies that affect the economy, redistribution of wealth, all of that. So the more it does that, the more the state is involved in the economy. And then the other dimension is how much are the economic interests involved in the state? How much control or power do they have over the state? And that can be lobbying, campaign contribution, bribes if we want to go too far with it. And so every state can be categorized across these two dimensions. So there's basically four combinations or four possible types of states to look at. And so here we see the figure in the book that shows us our two dimensions. So the horizontal one is a low or high amount of involvement of the state in the economy. So this side here would be states that do have a lot of involvement of the state in the economy, a lot of regulation, laws, policies that affect the economy, that sort of thing. And then states on this side are the ones where it's not very involved in the economy. And then on the vertical, it's how much does the economic interest, how much influence they have on the state. Here they have a lot of interest or influence, I should say, on the state, and down here they have a lot less. And so this is the picture of it in words. You end up with this way of describing the four different types of state. And so now we can see that if you have a lot of involvement of the economy in the state, but the state is not very involved in the economy, that is actually going to be called a failed state. A predatory is one that is high on both, and a night watchman is low on both. And then developmental state is the one that does not have a lot of economic influence on the state. So the state is fairly independent of the economic interests, but it is strong enough to actually have an influence on the economy. That's the developmental state. Now that we have this model, we can use it to define what is a successful economic system in the polity. And so he's saying that you cannot have a successful state if the economic interests are using the power of the state for their own benefit. So that would be a predatory state or a failed state. So we need a state that is strong enough to resist those sorts of economic pressures. And so that means that we are looking for the ones that have the involvement of economy in the state relatively low, which, looking at the diagram, means we're either looking at a night watchman state or a developmental state. But he shares with us that night watchman states don't exist. They are a figment of our imagination. So that means that the only possible example of a successful state would be the developmental state. And that's his conclusion here, that today all successful economic systems have varying degrees of a developmental state. So sort of summarizing what would make a developmental state successful would be this collection of criteria that you can see how challenging it would be to achieve. A developmental state would need to be strong enough to restrain the private interests that are actually conflicting with the common good. The state has to have sufficient power to resist being captured by those private economic interest groups. It has to be able to be strong enough to actually enforce the laws and protect citizens' rights, either from other citizens or outside the state. The state needs to be able to check its own power so it doesn't become a predatory state. There needs to be an encouragement of democratic participation, and yet we still need laws that restrain special interest groups. And the state needs to be able to use taxation to extract some of the surplus to use it productively. Because if you remember back what we were saying in the economy, they need to be able to generate a surplus and use it productively. That still shows up here. So that's why you do need a state strong enough to be involved in the economy, because that is going to allow it to solve some of those collective action problems, and deal with some of those issues. So that's what we mean by this last point for a successful state. And finally, we can get to our third realm, the civil society, what would make it successful. And I suppose the first thing you'd want to do is just have some idea of what is the civil society. It is the communities that govern the civil society. And so here's just a list of some of the things you can think of when you think of the civil society. It can be rather small, like a neighborhood. It can be a broader institution, like a labor union. All sorts of civic organizations, your homeowners association, maybe a garden club, those sorts of things. The various clubs that focus around businesses and industries, and then some of the more fun things like sports teams, and of course churches and other religious institutions. Any of these would be part of the civil society. So what communities are good at is creating and sustaining the social and cultural capital that we said was kind of missing from the economy, needed but not really generated there. That is created in the civil society area, as well as human capital. Um, Positive role models, peer pressure, how children are being raised. This is how our important social, cultural, and human capital is being sustained. The community is also good at solving some collective action problems through informal rules, implicit agreement about how things are supposed to be done, what are the common practices. The community can also provide important feelings of identity, meaning to life, as a purpose. The values that a community holds provides this sense of meaning and purpose to our lives. Communities can also make political governance actually work better. So even though that's in the realm of the state, this expectation that you should be a good citizen, that you should maybe create organizations that take care of things without a state coming in and enforcing it. These are all aspects of what a successful civil society can provide. He does not provide us a very clever little model for what a successful civic society is, because if you go back to that list of some of our examples of communities, they're very different. And, you know, what's good for one may not work for another. So if it's a really big community, it does give it more resources, but it does lose some of the immediacy and the personal relationships. If we're looking at something that is very diverse, it means that there are more alternatives, but then they can start to fall apart because there's less cohesion. Exclusivity of the community. Is it easy to join? Is it not? If it can make it more unified, but then again, you can have less diversity. Go back to the previous point. And then there's hierarchy. How is it set up? Is decision making in a very clear cut way? Well, then you can probably proceed very easily, but then that can actually dampen how much people feel connected to the community.